Welcome to this edition of Diligence Inside Australia's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter and I'll be your host for today's show. We're here at the Governance Institute of Australia National Conference, and it's a collection of company secretaries and directors all trying to get their arms around governance and board issues. And today's topic is an interesting one. We're going to talk about articulating risk appetite. And joining me is somebody that has a lot of experience in that. Darryl Newton is the non-executive director for ING Bank and spent a good part of his career as a chief risk officer at multiple companies. Welcome, Darryl.
Thank you.
So you just finished giving a very good presentation on this very topic. You had a great crowd, a lot of questions. And I think a good place for us to start is sort of lay a foundation on what articulating risk appetite is.
Thank you very much. As you probably be aware, risk appetite statements have become a fairly primary and fundamental part of the governance processes inside institutions. Many organisations are on multiple iterations of their risk appetite statements and frameworks, so they're starting to gain an experience in dealing with them. Yet, from a management and from a board perspective, doing a proper job of articulating risk appetite from board all the way down to the floor is still a problematic activity. So today's exercise was trying to understand what makes risk appetite statements and frameworks rather hard work, and then to go and explore what management can be doing and what board can be doing to help those processes.
But from a practical sense, when I hear the term articulating risk appetite, that statement has an impact on planning, it has an impact on strategy, because it's sort of determining, first of all, you have to take risk. If you don't have risk, you don't have reward, okay? So, and this is sort of, this process that's going to be between management and the board is sort of setting that somewhat sort of the guidelines from which to operate, that's saying this is the risk reward that we feel we can tolerate. Is that accurate?
Look, 100% accurate. In very simple terms, the first thing that starts is strategy, and strategy needs to be considered in the context of risk and the risk reward equation. Are we taking enough risks? Are we doing the right things? But the risk appetite statement is something that should be there to enable strategy to occur. It should be founded and based on strategy. That's a top of house setting, and it should be articulated as an enabler rather than as a limiter, if you will. So embedded in frameworks are enough things that will limit appetite on credit risk, on financial risk taking, whatever it might be. But your appetite statement at large should be used in a positive way to enable strategy.
Let's take that, what you've just described as our foundation, and now let's put it in the context of the board, okay? So in comes the plan or pieces of the plan or whatever, and you're sitting there on a board. Sort of what's the board's responsibility? They set these guidelines or these parameters, and now things are coming in. So describe the board's responsibility for not only the setting the appetite, but also looking at plans and saying, does this fit?
Well, firstly, let's remind ourselves the context of a boardroom, and it's a social system. It's an interaction of people, and the context is also, on the entity that you're governing. That's the true context. But the point that I'm trying to make is that a risk appetite statement and framework is going to help the board get itself together on the same page, in a sense, by sitting down and writing a document as a board. It gives you an opportunity to take ownership, to use board speak, to use your own language around what are the important facets of this business we want to deal with. And it also gives you a structure and a discipline, this is where the framework side kicks in, to create a conversation not only amongst the board, but also between the board and management. So it can be used as a powerful tool. It's not just a collection of words, it's something that's in the board's toolkit.
So is this something that the board actually writes, or is management submitting something that they're tinkering with?
Yes, the answer is typically management will put a proposition up. Go figure. It's like every other board paper that is, management are introducing something in there for discussion and dialogue. In the session I had, I used the example of, I wrote the Westpac one 13 years ago, the first risk appetite statement. And we thought we had it right, and we thought we'd done all of our socialisation with the right people, including the chair of the risk committee. We got into the board on about the third iteration of the document, looked at the body language between the chair of the risk committee and the chair of the board and went, hello, we have a problem here. Now what was occurring was that the chairman was taking the document and he wanted to use language that resonated more highly with him and therefore with the board. So it was brilliant. He took ownership, he used his own speak. We got a bit upset because it went offline for a while, but the power of that conversation was amazing in that chair taking ownership of that statement and the contents thereof.
And that had you both on the same page then, which is obviously very critical for this.
100% accurate.
So you sit on the board and here comes a plan in and whatever. Have you ever thought, when you look at that plan, do you look and say, is this within the scope of the risks that we should be taking as a company from a board perspective?
One of the joys of being a board member is that your tenure is probably longer than the CEO. It's probably longer than the Chief Risk Officer. So you've got to put yourself in the mindset of that long-term, perhaps a long-term investor equivalent mindset. So your governance responsibilities, do precisely that. So when you're firstly looking at a risk appetite statement, the things that you're thinking about are not just the short-term success of the firm, but the sustainability of the firm through time, and hopefully also, with a casting your mind forward to the things that are going to be impacting you in today's environment and in tomorrow's environment. So that's the attitude that you take as a board member. So your readership really does have a separate lens or a different lens than perhaps some of the bottom-up construction that may originate from management.
Yeah, it's a great point. And it makes your process of doing that easier when you're thinking long-term. You don't have to say, okay, I got to take care of this group of shareholders who want this and this group who want that.
In a sense, management think about the constraints of the short term, the budgets, the amount of available capital to invest, things like that, where the board are thinking, yes, I accept and acknowledge that, but are thinking longer in terms of the aspiration of what you're building to. So in one sense, those appetite conversations should at a minimum reflect the length of the strategy period that you're building that strategy for, and perhaps longer.
Yeah, so that's a good segue into talking about now management's part of the appetite, okay, the risk appetite. So talk about the nuances of that as their role in setting the risk appetite.
Thanks. You've got to, again, put yourself in the shoes of management, and there were a few reminders to management in the presentation that I did. And one of the reminders was also perhaps just to embolden them and take control. So just as I've articulated that it's a powerful tool in the board toolkit for a risk manager or a chief risk manager, chief risk officer, and even the CEO. To some extent, it's one of the most powerful tools that they have in their toolkit. So two comments. One is they get the opportunity to create the agenda. They get the opportunity to style that conversation and fashion it at its outset. And they get to focus on what they understand is as important. Second comment is that the conversation that we had was trying to remind the audience that when they step into the boardroom, they are absolutely on display, as is their CEO. So if you put those two comments together, the appetite document and the framework and the conversations that you craft will reflect on management's competency and CEO's competency for employing those people, and that they are absolutely on display. So they've got to lift their game to think about it from the board perspective, but it's an important tool for the manager.
But think about I mean, this is a process that you have to go through, but you have talent risk, you have financial risk, you have operating risk, you have cyber risk, you have
Yep.
all those things have to go into the statement or formula, all of it, not specifically, but collectively,
Yep.
you have to do that. So how does one, how does one take all those risks, and then that doesn't even count black swan risks, which are things that you can't predict, okay?
Fair. Fair.
So how does one, just give me some insight, because I'm sure in your past you had to be an initial author of some of that through management coming up.
Yeah. There are three thoughts that occur to me. One that we've spoken of already, and that is that if you start with strategy enablement as an objective, then you've got a body of work to work with. And given that it's strategy, it will be high level, but I'll use that expression, top of house again. So it's what matters from the very top. The second thought is, yes, risk appetite statements cover a large array of statements. At one place I worked, we kind of chunked it down into would we like more of something or less of something, and we had 43 subjects. Right? So that's a lot to deal with. Third comment is one of the good things about the risk world is it's good at rating things and ranking things. So this is where the frameworks will come in rather handy to help you do precisely that, just trying to filter out the less important and focus on the more important. One last thought that was occurring to me. I had a new CEO at a company recently, and that CEO looked at all of these papers, appetite statements, board reports, risk reports, etc., closed the folder and said, "You're the Chief Risk Officer, you tell me what are the major risks that I should be worried about, or what are the ones that worry you." Now, what that means is that the risk fraternity are actually expected to be across a very large array of categories and nature, and that's one of the skills of that team.
Yeah.
Properly chosen.
Well, I think there's some very practical statements in what you've talked about. And Darryl, I want to thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us today.
Thank you very, very much.
And that will conclude this edition of Inside Australia's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again soon when we take another look at a topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you then.